The thing about Left 4 Dead's development was the game was actually different in the beta versions. It was a lot more darker, and there was even different iterations of the characters way back in the day. And they had to go a long way in order to get to what we finally got in the game. It's probably one of the most interesting aspects of Left 4 Dead's development because the game was trading hands with Turtle Rock and Valve at the time. For so many people, there's actually the fact that we can even see this type of content and look at the models to this day is actually incredibly rare. So we have a blessing in disguise, considering that there's actually a rip of what the exact models looked like at the time, and their completely different designs can be viewed in game even. Valve and Turtle Rock were working out on exactly what they were going to do with these characters, and the models actually reflect the many stages of development at the time. And this is actually a big part of the community, considering it's the actual beta assets. I mean, people were kind of creating their own spins on what they thought the characters would look like, and you know, this just doesn't live up to the actual stuff that we got, as this would be allowed to be released to the community, and they even had a blog post showing this stuff off. Also, if you guys are watching this video, make sure to subscribe if you want more content like this. You guys are the best. Seriously, it means a lot to me that you guys... Seriously, if you enjoy this stuff, hit the subscribe button. Thank you. There's a Discord down below if you're cool and you want to join that. There's only cool people allowed. Now, there's actually some hiccups here and there as far as the way some of these characters are presented. I mean, this was slapped together actually pretty quickly, considering that, and there's actually versions of these mods that actually fix some of the issues with this original release. But this is probably why this is some of the most sought after beta content for Left 4 Dead's entire community, because for many, many years, people wanted these models so bad. And it released in a pretty interesting way. A community member named Splinks was actually working with Valve at the time, and he actually convinced Valve to actually allow this beta content to be released to the community. Now, obviously, this was kind of slapped together pretty quickly, but they did release what they could. It does have some certain aspects that couldn't be transferred over, and they had to fix certain bugs with it, but that's why there's actual iterations that build on these original designs on this original release right here. But it's pretty insane for a company to allow beta content to be released like this. Could you imagine Nintendo doing that? Allowing this type of content to be accessed by the community is actually a really rare thing for a company to do, so I give shoutouts to Valve for at least allowing this type of stuff to be out there. I mean, imagine if Nintendo did this with Pokemon. Like, this would never happen with them. Now, there's actually some big changes between these characters and what we would get in the final version of the game. What they ended up resembling is some of the biggest changes in a lot of Valve's character development. Some of these are actually completely different models, and they have some of the largest changes, while some of them are definitely a little bit more of the seeds of what they would become. But it's important to know there's actually many different builds of Left 4 Dead. There's some early stages dating all the way back to when they were trying to throw around these early ideas of what these characters were going to be. There was even stuff like concept art that was showing actual actors that they actually wanted some of these characters to be inspired by or to even play off of, or some early doodles of certain ideas for these characters in later stages. This would be some of the early art creating the models for these characters, as some of these would actually inspire their final designs, while some of them are a little bit more out there, as this stuff actually has leaked here today. So this is stuff people don't normally actually talk about as far as Left 4 Dead content goes. But this will show at the very end of the video some of the more interesting changes that we're seeing. So you're going to want to make sure to stay tuned, because this is going to get good, baby. Now, Lewis right here is probably one of the earliest looks at a Left 4 Dead character as far as his concept art. Some of you might be asking, wait, is this a completely different character? Like, who is this guy? This nerdy white guy with glasses actually was the original starting point of where they would go with Lewis's character, as this was used on a campaign poster for a scrapped Left 4 Dead campaign, damn it. This is the actual campaign poster they were using to test it. This was what the survivors would have looked like in their very early iterations. Obviously, some of the similarities you would get to the final version of Lewis, you can see here, like the button-up shirt, and obviously the tie being a part of his design, but there's also a weird middle stage where he actually changed it again. And this is where actually, I mean, there's a different face, he has glasses, it's almost a completely different person. But let's take a look at the next stage of development, or at least one of the more well-known ones. where this is Lewis again, and he looks almost completely unrecognizable, as one of the similarities with a lot of the Left 4 Dead beta designs, a lot of them look really dark. Now here he has an afro and really dirty clothing, and he also has a baggy coat and gloves. I mean, pretty much every single character here has gloves, and even having a different face model. This is one of the early designs that people actually bring up as far as, it's probably one of the most different designs compared to what he would eventually become in the final version of the game, where Valve went with a more cleaner, realistic approach and actually revisited some of the early ideas of when they were sketching out what Lewis was going to be. And they also made him bald, and also is most likely an alternative way of avoiding having to animate hair, because yeah, animating hair is actually big problem in the Source engine, so making a lot of these characters bald was done deliberately, or, you know, giving them a hat to probably make this a little bit easier on the engine. It's also possible Lewis might have a different performance. I mean, if he looked completely different, the voice actor did mention that he might have gave a different performance if they went this direction with Lewis, because in his early sessions he thought Lewis had to be deeper because he looks kind of gruffy here. But obviously I'm glad the direction they ended up going with, because could you imagine him like saying pills here in a really deep voice? I can't imagine that. All the Lewis memes might have not existed if they went this direction. Think about that. For Bill, it actually seems like his design stayed relatively the same, even in these earliest versions of the character. It seems like they wanted a veteran type character, but obviously he's a little bit more rough looking here, and he has a different face model, and also his clothes resemble a little bit more of a darker theme, just like the other characters. Bill is also my favorite character in the game, so I can't imagine them going with these early designs here, because he looks so much better in the finalized version of the character, and he looks a little bit more of a nicer character compared to what he looked like here. So Francis in this early iteration actually resembles qualities of the beta model, except he's a little bit more overweight and he has longer hair, which goes all the way down to his shoulders. He also has a completely different face. You can still see some of the overall idea for the character still remaining even in the final version of the character. They obviously got a different face model, and they made him bald, because I think animating his hair was probably going to be a problem, and many other devs have actually stated that. Francis also has pretty much the exact same ideas. There's some couple design small detail changes here and there, like his tattoos looking a little less defined, but I think what they did with the final version of Francis was the smart move, because honestly I can't imagine him any other way. He's pretty funny in the final game, so I can't imagine this guy having the same sense of humor. I don't know, he looks a little bit more scary. Now Zoe probably has the most interesting changes from the earlier drafts, is she actually had a completely different character model. There's also some different stages of where they were kind of spinning around different ideas for Zoe, as you can kind of see here. Kind of throwing around ideas, maybe giving her tactical gear with her clothing, but there is some similarities to the general idea of where Zoe would end up in the final game. Also, she has tall socks, and obviously they would make her more of a realistic looking character in the final version of the game. But also Zoe has almost a completely different makeover, and they decided to ditch the tactical gear and give her more realistic clothing, which I think, obviously is going to work, because she's supposed to be a college student, not, what this is. One of the most interesting changes is actually not to any of the related model work, it's actually to Zoe's leftover voice lines that are in the game. In the early development, she actually had a completely different voice actor. The other characters actually don't have this. So for Zoe only, she has some interesting lines here and there which are actually delivered completely differently, because, there's someone else actually doing these lines.
All right, guys, there's a boat on its way. Okay, the helicopter's coming. Okay, guys, help's on the way. Help's coming, guys. We just need to last a little longer. Okay, there's a plane on the way. Okay, guys, I called for a truck.
They would obviously go with a more iconic, well-known voice actor for the final version of the game, which, is literally the voice of Peach, so it makes sense. And Cortana. So midway in development, Zoe had these completely different lines by a different voice actor, and you can even hear them in these early trailers. Now, how you actually get these to trigger in game, well, you could use either a vocalizer, or, if you're bored, you could dig into the files and, try to find them yourself. But there's actually some ways you can trigger them if you get lucky. Like, for example, in some of the finales, Zoe will actually use some of these lines during the No Mercy or Death Toll finale, and she will actually make call-outs for when the rescue chopper is going to come. And some of the leftover lines will actually trigger during these finales. That's at least when I've heard these lines more specifically. So in conclusion, the models represent some of the earliest points in Left 4 Dead's development. Quite a few changes before they landed on where they ended up going in the final game. And they obviously didn't keep these designs, at least in the more well-known stage of development that people commonly call back to. They're a big figure in Left 4 Dead's overall development, as it shows that the game was a lot darker in this point. And they obviously wanted to change these characters and make them more relatable and realistic. So that's why they went from such a big change as far as their design goes. I think they wanted these characters to be a little bit more relatable and have a bit more of a visual appeal to them. And I think the more saturated colors also make them stand out more, at least in levels. Could you imagine trying to find these survivors in, this version of the game? It was probably a lot harder when the game looks really, really dark. And obviously there wasn't like glows on survivors, at least at certain points of development. So it was probably really hard to find them and see them in dark corners and crevices. But I'm actually pleased with what they ended up going with in the final game, because I can't really imagine the survivors any other way. Would this version of Francis hate everything? Maybe he would, actually. Maybe that aspect would be the same. Compared to Left 4 Dead 2 of what we were actually seeing with even the survivors development in that game, which I could do a separate video even on that, the Left 4 Dead 1 survivors, you can see the more interesting changes because the game in itself was changing a lot in development. I mean, these old versions of the survivors were almost in a completely different atmospheric vibe of the game where everything was grungier and more dystopian looking. So it made sense when they decided to, change things up a little bit more, and Valve had a little bit more of a hand in that and making things more realistic, that obviously the characters would fall in line with that theme too. Which is why I'm kind of glad we ended up where we're at to this day. I can't imagine these characters looking any other way. We had to get there somehow, but it's cool to see where it started.